Hello, hello. We're going to continue our analysis series on Persona 5 today. As stated previously in both the playthrough and in the other analysis video, this game deals with heavy topics like attempted suicide, various forms of abuse, heavy themes. If you don't want to engage with that, you don't have to. You can just skip this. Before we begin, we need to address the elephant in the room that kind of happens across the game. The localization is pretty rough. There's pronunciation issues, there's punctuation issues in the actual written dialogue, and there's some really awkward line reads just throughout the story. It hurts the narrative in that it's noticeable enough to be a distraction. However, the theming and writing are still incredibly strong, so the actual quality of the story is not negatively affected too much, but it is enough to notice, and so I did need to mention it. I'm going to go about this analysis in sections because stories are multifaceted, and each section kind of builds into a larger whole, but it's better, generally speaking, to kind of look at stories in chunks. I could go about it chronologically, but what it would do is I would go, the writers do this narrative device, and then like 20 minutes later, I would then say, again, the writers are using the same narrative device over and over and over. It's much better just to talk about these kind of things in sections. However, if you would rather I go chronologically just for clarity and just to make sure that I've hit every single thing in succession, then please let me know in the comments and I will adjust. First off, we're going to look kind of how the main plot is handled. We shift to about half a year before, and the writers take the time to reintroduce our main character in a more natural environment, a more normal environment, giving him more characterization, because before he was jumping around in a casino in a weird outfit. So this lets us see what he's like normally away from that. They also use multiple cutscenes, the dialogue, and the gameplay to kind of establish the setting just across the board. We're allowed to wander around, we're allowed to talk to people, these kind of things. And in this very first scene, they give us our chapter 1 hook. I mentioned in the prologue video before that the prologue hook and the chapter 1 hook should be different, because if you ask the same question twice, you're not actually adding anything in the prologue. In fact, if the prologue question is the same as the chapter 1 question, the question that the audience is more likely to have is, why did you delay the plot for this little section in the beginning? You should just cut it. They did not do that. They did give us 2 different questions. In the prologue, it was, why are we here in this casino? Whereas in chapter 1, the very first hook is, what are the mental shutdowns? You see the 2 girls talking about it. If for some reason the player did not notice that one, they give us a more obvious one a little later to make sure the player is invested by the end of the first scene. Their main foreshadowing technique throughout this arc, and honestly throughout much of the story, is Chekhov's guns. For those who are unaware of what that is, a Chekhov gun is described as, if you describe a gun in the first act, it must go off in the third act. What it primarily means is that if you take the time to describe something, it has to be relevant to the plot somehow a little later. If you don't make this thing that you've taken the time to describe or show, then it's a waste of space. So the good example in the prologue is the syringe. They keep showing us the syringe to show that our main character is not reliable as a narrator because he's been drugged. In this case, they're showing the phone app multiple times right before something supernatural happens in order to kind of let the player connect the dots of, oh, maybe the phone app is causing this to happen. Also during this arc, Ryuji struggles to run often, which is immediately important to his character arc. But these are like little bitty parts of foreshadowing that they use consistently so that whenever the big things happen, it's not a shock to the audience. The audience probably already knows what's going on before the big thing happens. It's a really good way to make all of these things believable. Most of the dialogue in this section is exposition, explaining the setting, the game mechanics, the plot. A lot of the dialogue is purely world building and exposition, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but that's what almost all of the dialogue is. It has some secondary purposes too, like how each character talks is important to their individual characterizations, because we're meeting a lot of characters really quickly. And so having such strong ways that they talk is important, but the actual function of the dialogue as exposition. Speaking of the characterizations of everyone we're meeting are really strong and really clear. My favorite example of it in this arc is the scene where we first encounter An, Kamoshida, and Ryuji all at the same time. I mentioned this in the playthrough itself, but they adjust the entire vibe of the scene when our character sees An. The camera is moved to first person and kind of lingers on her more than it has lingered on any other character. And they drastically change the music to also feel right at home in a romance anime. She's a girl in a JRPG, specifically a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, pretty girl. Like, she's an ideal of beauty, aesthetically. Our main character thinks she's attractive. Duh. However, the same scene also establishes a baseline for her relationship with Kamoshida, because as far as we know, as a first-time player, he's offering her a ride to school in the rain, and neither me or her have an umbrella. He also looks at us, the main character, and also asks if we want a ride to school. So it looks like a kind gesture. He's offering us shelter from the rain. However, when we turn him down, they make sure to give us a close-up of An's face to show that she's not happy to be in that car for some reason. Even if I, as the player, can't get a feeling of why, or even exactly why her face looks that way, the general demeanor is a negative one. We know that she's not pleased to be there. This is also foreshadowing for the first arc, because it kind of lets us know that Kamoshida is the villain here. He's the one that's going to be causing the trouble because this girl is not liking the guy right off the bat. And it's reinforced by Ryuji after the car drives away. He comes up and is angry. He's aggressive. So they really quickly show that antagonistic relationship between Ryuji and Kamoshida right after showing that An doesn't like being in the car with him. Also, the aggressive way that Ryuji talks is, again, real solid characterization right off the bat. It's really strong. Across this arc, they're also doing a lot of really good spectacle. It's not used very often, and it usually always has some kind of secondary purpose. My favorite examples are all of the Persona awakening scenes, because they are always accompanied by the characters making a stand based on their own morals. And so the Persona awakening scene is their reward for doing that. Another of my favorite examples is when you can see the castle kind of being rippled and overlaid over the school. It's one of my favorite things. It's also done in gameplay a couple of times where you're jumping across the chandeliers, you're climbing up the really tall tower in the castle. Like, those are some big set piece moments. And so we get some sense of that spectacle. Anyway, on to the main plot itself. We have our train scene, the Shibuya scene, and we meet Suguru. After some really basic characterization for him, we're given a lot of exposition. By itself, the exposition is fine. However, we already got a visual scene explaining this or showing what happened.
Please help!
Damn brat! I'll sue!
We already know that our main character is here because he protected a woman from a man who was trying to molest her. We already know this, but Suguru then takes the time to fully explain how we got here.
You protected some woman from a man forcing himself on her. He got injured, then sued you, right? That's what you get for sticking your nose in a matter between two adults. You did injure him, yeah? And now that you've got a criminal record, you were expelled from your high school. The courts ordered you to transfer and move out here, which your parents also approved. In other words, they got rid of you for being a pain in the ass.
This happens again right after that really nice scene that I had just praised. Ryuji then spells it out that Kamoshida's not a good dude. Like, all these things already happened.
He does whatever the hell he wants. Who does he think he is, the king of a castle? Don't Don't you agree?
We get explanations about what a persona is very quickly after awakening to our persona. In fact, that's kind of a rhythm to the story, is they will show us visually and clearly, like the visuals are not subtle, what's happening and what's going on, but then they always reinforce it by then going into exposition dialogue all the time. It's everywhere. On the one hand, it's contributing to that strong theming and the writing that I've already praised. It's what makes the character so strong. It's what makes the plot so strong. However, it's also the reason why the game is slow. It demonstrates that the writer doesn't trust the audience to understand what they're saying through the visuals. They're expecting the audience to just not notice all of these visual cues that are a bit more nuanced and subtle. The game feeling like it's always holding your hand is one of the things that this game was criticized for on release. To be fair, that hand-holding is also happening in the gameplay. There's a tutorial for everything. Even if they've already explained it through dialogue, or if the player has already been like doing the things that the tutorial is teaching. However, to be equally fair to the writers, I have also seen games that do attempt to do the more subtle, just showing it visually and the more nuanced ways be called convoluted. And I've also seen games that when they attempt to do abstract themes or themes that are not really obvious from a first look, the plot is often called confusing in those games. So it's possible they were trying to avoid that criticism at all costs because they use Jungian psychology as their main narrative device with the shadows and the personas and all that. So that's a mixed bag. I personally would rather they just give me some respect and let me figure it out, but that's me. Once our main character is all settled in and goes to sleep, we're introduced to the Velvet Room. Existing Persona fans or fans that have already played through this game once will be familiar with the Velvet Room because it is a recurring location in the series, but the writers assume that the player is brand new, which is really smart. They should assume this. Personally, I really like what they do here because for the new players, it's of course an introduction to the Velvet Room. It's introducing you to Igor. It's introducing you to this space and what this space represents. And it's exposition for a new player. However, for Persona fans or second-time players, they're given so much more. And it's all delivered via the word choice that Igor uses and also the developer's choice on who the voice actor is. Persona fans may notice that Igor refers to the Velvet Room using the word my. He says, "Welcome to my Velvet Room." Igor has never, in any previous Persona game, claimed ownership of the Velvet Room. In fact, he usually says, when introducing his assistant, she or he is a resident of this place like myself. He places him and his assistant on the same tier. However, both Justine and Caroline call him their master, which is not normal. All of this serves as foreshadowing for something far later in the game. This is a very big Chekhov's gun, but the player is more likely only going to notice this if they already know the residents of the Velvet Room, either via other Persona games or if they've played Persona 5 before. Also, a really clever thing they did with their choice in voice actor is they understood that people who are already Persona fans would probably know before the game's release that both the Japanese voice actor and the English voice actor for Igor, like his original voice actor, had passed away during the development of Persona 5. So fans were already expecting the voice to be adjusted a little bit. However, even with that knowledge, this Igor sounds very different than most Igors in the series. Igor normally has a more high-pitched voice, and he's a bit more creepy and kind of, like he's just more in an upper range. This one is deep and gravelly and dark. Like, this is a really deep-voiced Igor. So, even with the knowledge of this is going to have a voice change, this is a very different Igor, which also probably kind of goes, I don't know if I'm on board with this Igor, you know, that kind of feeling. Another thing they do is they kind of change the win condition, quote, quote, of how our main character can get out of his situation. Igor claims that the main character must be rehabilitated to avoid ruin, does not define these two terms at all. And the implications are notably different from what the butterfly said in the prologue. The butterfly was really clear. Our goal is to say what happened in a clear and accurate way, and you will get out of this alive. Igor uses these vague rehabilitation and ruin terms, but doesn't define them and doesn't give us a lot of information. So depending on how you see Igor, you can either think that he's trying to kind of muddy the waters and add some confusion, or it's foreshadowing for your eventual capture. It depends on how you see Igor. Both are valid. Just as some fun little trivia, every Velvet Room resident is a reference to something in the universe of Frankenstein, which is a nice nod to previous Persona games because Philemon created the Velvet Room and its residents. They are created beings, not born beings. So that's cute. Anyway, as we go along, we're shown what the school looks like so they can change it into the castle later. And Shujin Academy is a play on words because Shujin is a word for prisoner. It's also what Caroline calls you in the Japanese instead of inmate. They do some nice work expanding on Sojiro's characterization because he's willing to feed you. He worries about you when he realizes that it's going to rain and you don't have an umbrella. He's even willing to trust you a little bit by asking you to change the sign around, even though he's constantly threatening to throw you out. It's kind of all set up to show that he's secretly not as much of a hard ass as he's trying to play. It's a nice little thing that they do with a lot of the side characters is they give little bitty breadcrumbs, little bitty hints that this character might be swayed to your side at some point. Everything up to meeting the Shadow Kamoshida is either exposition and world building, or it's direct foreshadowing to make the castle and the meeting of the Shadow feel believable. Seeing a castle spring up where the school should be should not be a surprise to the player by the time it shows up, because so much weird things have been happening already that the castle showing up is now our reward if we noticed all of those things. Also, having the Shadow show up right after the player met the real Kamoshida is a really good narrative technique because it's commonly used to make an audience compare these two things side by side because they show up side by side in the story. It's mostly used to compare protagonists and antagonists or a protagonist to their foil, but it can be used to compare any two things by placing them right next to each other like this, as long as they have enough differences to be noticeable. Again, Persona fans will kind of be a little faster on figuring out what's going on just because Persona 4 uses a similar design for their shadows, like their big name shadows. They like their glowing yellow eyes. It's a common thing. The scene inside the jail cell is fantastic because we have our first solid characterization on Kamoshida through his shadow, and Ryuji is given more nuance here because he's willing to take the beating for essentially some guy he just met, a stranger, just because he doesn't want to see our character get hurt. Most of the actual gameplay scenes and the scenes with Kawakami and Ryuji later are exposition, world building, and tutorials, but the player could use them to get a clearer picture of Kamoshida's character and how he treats the students around him. We get to a scene also where we kind of meet the SIU director. On the one hand, they make it crystal clear this man is a corrupt official, and that knowledge is something the player would need later on. However, the SIU director, as far as we're aware, is related to Sainijima. And yes, we know who Sainijima is through the prologue, but she hasn't shown up in the flashback yet. He's also not relevant to the first arc, Kamoshida's arc, at all. He doesn't become relevant until like the midpoint of the story, which is hours from now. So bringing him into the story at this point is kind of unnecessary. They could have delayed his arrival until he was going to be more immediately relevant, or they could have made him some kind of twist villain to be more impactful. I just don't see why he needed to be brought in here when they could have delayed it. It feels like it slows the pacing down just to shoehorn him in here. Doesn't make any sense. Because the story mostly hits its rhythm about this point, we're gonna switch focus to the characters. Take what I've said before and apply it to the rest of the arc, and you have a clear picture of how the arc goes. But let's start with our main character. On top of the characterization we already got from the prologue, they add in that he's in the situation he's in because he did the right thing by helping a woman get away from a man who was trying to molest her and was sued for doing so. So you can, at the very minimum, tell that he's got a pretty good sense of what's right and wrong and is kind of self-sacrificial a little bit. But he is a silent protagonist. They're not going to have as much characterization as any other character because they're silent. and we're allowed to adjust how this character acts. So my main character might be different than someone else who plays the game's main character, but that's at least the baseline. Next is Ryuji, because we meet him next. His visual design tells the player a lot about him from the beginning. His hair is dyed blonde, and he's aggressive in his speech and mannerisms. Typical delinquent. And you can tell that his hair is dyed before they actually say his hair is dyed, because his eyebrows are still brown. And the character model has the hair darken as it gets closer to the roots of his head. So, nice little nod there. However, they quickly start dropping little breadcrumbs about him, little hints. First, they show him struggling to run inside the castle, but a teacher says later that he used to be the star of the track team. These two facts don't add up. A kid on the track team would be bounding in front of our character. He would have no trouble running around at all. The good part about all this is that the player could reasonably figure out that something is not quite correct. You can figure out a lot of it right away without them having to tell you, because we know that Kamoshida's shadow has no problem abusing Ryuji physically, either from an actual physical standpoint, he's an adult man beating up a teenager, but also from a moral standpoint, he shows no hesitation in doing so. In fact, he seems to enjoy it. So you take that, add in the clear animosity Ryuji has for him, and we also know that he's not in track anymore, and also you add in the fact that he's having trouble running, you can kind of figure out some basic elements of what happened to make him not be able to run around a palace. They do, however, take the time to fully explain it in detail during his persona awakening, just like all the other plot elements I've talked about. However, from all these different scenes, the player can form a really basic idea of who Ryuji is. Last year, he did stand up to a teacher who was abusing him and his team and became crippled because of it. Kamoshida broke his leg. It's reinforced by him taking that beating for our main character when they first get there. And when On tries to come along, he uses his aggression and yells at her because he knows that the castle is dangerous and doesn't want her to get injured, which means he is totally okay with using the image that people have of him to his advantage to protect them. That's his basic characterization. His little character arc in the confidant system also reinforces it, because his main motivations are that he loves his mom and wants to help the track team, even though they hate him and even though he doesn't actually want to go back to them. It doesn't matter what he might get from it, he just wants to help them out. So all of this is really solid characterization for this dude. However, the moment his role in the main plot is complete and he gets his persona, which is where his character arc ends for the most part, the writers focus on two aspects of his personality to the point where it's being called out by the other characters by the end of this arc. He's not smart and he's a loudmouth. Hasn't caused any major issues so far, but these two qualities are already beginning to overshadow his genuinely really good characterization. It doesn't make very much sense here. After that, we're going to talk about Morgana. His main characterization for him is that he's really impatient. He kind of skips ahead to us being part of his plan without actually getting us to agree to be part of his plan. He also gets mildly frustrated when our main character and Ryuji don't immediately jump on his plan to go steal the treasure, because there's a chance that someone could be killed. So you can kind of get the sense that he really wants his way to go the way he wants it to. He really wants to do what he wants to do and doesn't like when there are obstacles to that path. Other than that, his role at this point is to give us exposition, be a guide in the palace, and teach the player how the game works. That's what he is right now. He's basically just a mouthpiece for the tutorials. On is the biggest issue here. Her character arc at this point is about how Kamoshida is targeting her sexually and manipulating her into doing what he wants by using her best friend as leverage. This escalates to a point where Shiho, the best friend, attempts to commit suicide. And this suicide attempt is the inciting incident of the main plot. This is the point where the main characters have seen enough escalation to want to come together and do something about it. So this moment, this arc is so important that it's being tied to the main plot as a way to get it to start. That's On's character arc right there, is being a victim of sexual harassment. We have multiple scenes in which On clearly communicates how all this sexual harassment and unwanted attention makes her feel. She hates it. She's crying. She doesn't want this. However, the writers undermine this arc in a few massive key ways. First, before the arc is even resolved, Kamoshida is being replaced by Morgana as the guy who wants to get with her, the guy who's attracted to An, even though she doesn't want to be the object of someone's affection. She doesn't want it. She says she doesn't want it. When the writers take this time to make sure that at all times this character is being desired by another character, that becomes part of this character's characterization. It becomes a character trait, is that she is desired by this male character. And that's not appropriate for a character who has said that she doesn't want that. Also, the player is allowed to make sexual jokes at her expense during her arc where she's being sexually harassed by an adult man, a teacher. On top of that, even if the player decides, I don't want to do that, they add in little sexual jokes from other characters. Also, look at how they handle her Persona Awakening scene compared to Ryuji's. They focus on her chest, her legs, her mouth, which are all parts of a woman's body that are commonly sexualized. They're encouraging the player to see her as a sexual object, even if the player themselves do not want to. In reality, being the target of sexual harassment is scary and traumatizing, especially if it's done by an authority figure like a teacher, because it's harder to get away from. Minimizing it, joking about it, or encouraging it is not appropriate for this character because she's the victim of sexual harassment. And we know how she feels about being the target of sexual harassment. We know the details of why she feels this way. All of this is things that we know. This is not appropriate for this character specifically. It's just not. Anyway, finally, let's talk about Kamoshida. As the villain of this arc, his characterization is the most extensive because his actions directly affect the lives of at least 3 characters. He is the main focus of this arc, and which aspects of his personality the writers choose to focus on is directly related to whose arc he's interacting with. First, it's Ryuji, so we're focusing mainly on the physical abuse of the athletes, which is what he did to Ryuji. But when we first meet him, he looks like a regular guy and a nice guy. He offered to take us to school when it was raining and we didn't have an umbrella. We also get multiple scenes to show that he is respected and liked by other teachers and even the students that are not aware of what he's doing. During the volleyball rally, again, they mess with the camera where we get these nice 3 camera shot angles, and there's lots of sparkles, and they make sure that he looks very capable to kind of show how he is viewed by the people around him. He's a skilled athlete, and he's idolized as that skilled athlete. So he's kind of protected by the people around him. We also get a couple of scenes in which they actively protect him. The way he treats the athletes inside the castle is, again, explained to us as well as shown to us, but they also do a couple of things aside from just showing us inside the castle and Ryuji's testimony. There's rumors around the school about how beat up the volleyball players look. There's, of course, Ryuji himself, the castle. The character models on the volleyball team are incredibly beat up. All this reinforces it. It's not subtle. However, once they're done with Ryuji's arc, they then shift his atrocities to how he treats the girls' volleyball team, because there are 2 volleyball teams in this school, and they focus a lot more on the sexual abuse and the sexually assaulting and how he views female students. Again, they follow it up with rumors about Shiho, which is the best friend, as well as screaming coming from the PE faculty office. The castle itself gives us a few very obvious things that show that he does in fact desire young female girls. On, of course, is a really big one where they continually show that she's the victim of his sexual attention right now. We also get the inciting incident, which is Shiho attempting to commit suicide after he sexually assaults her. They spend a lot more time on this one because it's the more extreme thing that he's doing. This is the escalation. We also get to physically see that escalation because after we decline his invitation to be brought to school, the moment that other teachers or other people are out of view, he verbally threatens us by saying that if we step even a toe out of line, he's going to get us expelled, which is an abuse of power by a teacher. We haven't done anything, as well as the invasion of privacy that he does to our main character by making sure that our criminal record gets leaked. which is something he should not be able to do. From the verbal and the invasion of privacy, we then go to our knowledge of him physically abusing the boys. They escalated again by him physically abusing the girls. And then the final escalation is when he sexually assaults Shiho, and it causes an attempted suicide. And when we confront him about it, he follows through on that threat to get us expelled, and by giving us an ultimatum. This is a clear tension curve that escalates until we have to do something about it. The writers assigned him the sin of lust, most likely because of the sexual abuse, unless they're using the more modern version of lust, i.e. a lust for power, lust for recognition, lust for control, etc. But classically, biblically, lust is almost exclusively a sexual thing rather than how we use it nowadays, but they could be playing fast and loose with which definition of lust they want. Most of his characterization is obvious, but they do add some nuance here because, yes, we know the things that he is doing now, but we also know a little bit of what he did before. He used to be a gold medalist in volleyball, and they do say a couple of times that at least the principal has expectations of him, and he feels the need to meet those expectations. He feels pressured by the people around him to perform well and believes that he should be rewarded for doing so. He also appears to think that he's not doing anything wrong because everyone's turning a blind eye to his actions. And another authority figure is not attempting to stop him. They're all letting him do it because it generally benefits a lot of people. It makes the school look good so the principal and teachers are okay. Other teachers may not know what he's doing, and parents are probably turning a blind eye because they want their child to possibly get a recommendation to a good college. So he believes he's doing things that are acceptable. The writers are using his behavior to serve the greater theme of the story that something can be wrong, even if it's accepted, because the player is not supposed to agree with the villain. They're the villain. They're the bad guys. So they're telling us that him thinking this way is not correct. Something is wrong no matter who approves of it. Something is right no matter who approves of it. You know, like that's the theming we're going with here. Another thing they kind of hint at is that he believes that losing means that you lose everything. It means failure. And that may have been what happened to make him a teacher. He may have lost enough games in his athletic career and was removed from the Olympic team because of that. And he might see himself being a teacher as beneath his talents or even as a punishment. This behavior could be a result of his want to be rewarded and his frustration at being demoted, quote, quote, to a teacher. It does not make what he's doing acceptable, but it could be the reason why his desires became warped in the first place. People don't usually go bad for no reason. There's usually other factors. And so there is a little bit of that in the way that he's acting. They don't really go into the time before he was a teacher, so that's my interpretation using the information from the game as my base, but it's a possibility. But we're now back to the main plot. Once we storm the castle and steal the treasure, we are rewarded with Kamoshida's complete meltdown. It's most likely intended to be a visual confirmation that stealing the treasure has the desired effect, which is making the victim confess their sins without murdering them. That was the whole point. However, the characters seem kind of conflicted about whether it was right to force the confession. I know that the developers have stated that they want players to think of the moral implications of these forced confessions, but I don't think this specific goal was met. When you make your antagonist truly irredeemable by making them sexually assault a teenage girl, it's really difficult to then ask the players to wonder, but isn't forcing a confession wrong? Especially when the result is a guy who appears to have no ill effects from what happened, aside from him growing a guilty conscience. As an actual story scene, it actually works really well. It gives the player a form of catharsis, it confirms that this is the right thing that we're supposed to be doing, and it's a reward for storming this castle and doing this big dungeon. However, as a narrative tool that is supposed to make the player question the morality of their actions, I don't think it really succeeds because we're dealing with someone who is irredeemable, at least in the eyes of most of the players. You could possibly think that this is a way to force them to do something they normally would not do, but that's a really hard sell when you make a guy like this. It's just not something that most people are going to wonder. They might, I'm all for it, but it's hard to ask that of the player. But anyway, this has been the Kamoshida arc. Let me know any feedback in the comments. If you liked this, go ahead and give it a like. If you want more of this, go ahead and subscribe. We're going to do the next one after I am done with Madarame's arc, which is the next arc, and I hope to see some of you then. Bye!